Welcome to What's Your Signal, the podcast exploring the latest trends in enterprise technology, network security, and how we connect people, places, and things. You're joined by me, Taylor Walker, and my esteemed co-host, Mauricio Stefan. Hey, Mauricio.
Hi, Taylor. How's it going?
Good. How are you?
Oh, not too bad.
Good. So today we're talking about private cellular networks. I know we've talked about this a couple of other times on the podcast. It's come up in a lot of our conversations, and there's a reason for that, to be fair, especially if you're part of the manufacturing industry, which is kind of what we're leaning into today. So here's why we're talking about manufacturing with private cellular. Juniper, which is one of our great partners, they did some research that predicts there will be nearly 5,000 private networks in manufacturing by 2028, which will make up about 35% of the private network market. And I also recently read this cool case study where Hitachi, Ericsson, and AWS joined forces to design a private 5G network that enabled the customer to use computer vision to inspect 24 assembly components compared to like the one-by-one inspection model that they'd previously used. So something like that is a huge operational advantage that opens the door for further innovation, especially in a smart factory setting.
Yeah, I think manufacturing is definitely an early adopter of private cellular networks because they've been particularly challenged in deploying network into the manufacturing floor, right? They have a lot of high-powered machinery, which puts off a lot of interference, which makes Wi-Fi difficult, right? Being able to cover the manufacturing floor, just something of that size with enough Wi-Fi access points becomes, a little cost prohibitive. And then the alternative is running wires to all of those machines. And while in some cases that might be okay, where the machines are stationary and they don't plan on changing the lineup, or maybe they only manufacture one thing, or the manufacturing process doesn't change. But especially in newer, smart manufacturing with different autonomous kind of machines or autonomous moving machines like AGVs, obviously wires just don't work for that. And once again, being able to blanket a space like that with that kind of interference with Wi-Fi becomes extremely difficult. So they have definitely been one of the early adopters in private cellular because the cellular standards and the cellular spectrum help alleviate those issues that they've had with Wi-Fi in the past.
Absolutely. These manufacturers clearly understand the value of private cellular, and they're increasingly and proactively investing in those resources. And we have two guests here to help us better understand that integration of private cellular in manufacturing. StepCG's Private Network Program Director, Dan Gregory, and one of Ericsson's Senior Product Marketing Managers, Matt Addicks. Well, thanks for joining us, guys. I want to start by getting a little bit of a lay of the land and get your take on what is new in connected manufacturing and warehousing. Matt, why don't you kick it off for us?
So I think, there's a couple things that I'm seeing in connected manufacturing and warehousing. Actually, what's interesting is a lot of them aren't connected. Right? So they're really inefficient in how they run their operations. It's actually kind of mind-blowing with some of these customers that I'm talking to, where they're still using pen and paper, right? Or they're just kind of completely disjointed from a process perspective between different parts of the organization. So number one, it's really, again, it's just really mind-blowing how inefficient some operations are, right? But with that being said, I think there's significant opportunity from a connectivity perspective, right? So where I'm seeing a lot of enterprises really invest in connectivity, or actually more so why, is number one is just connecting their workforce. And it's a very simple use case, right? Using some kind of connected device like a scanner or an Android device or something like that. That's a very simple use case. They're also leveraging connectivity for autonomy. Autonomy in a couple different ways. Number one, autonomous mobile robots, AMRs, to move things around, right, around a facility. But also they're using robots, or what they're calling cobots now, to work alongside the physical workers. So that's one thing that's actually going to continue to emerge in the industry, specifically from a connectivity perspective, and also I would say from an edge compute perspective there as well. And that's across manufacturing and warehousing. And I think these two environments kind of go hand in hand. because they can be really challenged from a wireless perspective or just purely a connectivity perspective. The last thing that I would just touch on from a connectivity perspective is what a lot of organizations are struggling with is the flexibility they have in their operations as well, right? If everything's wired, all of their equipment is quite literally tied down, right? So if they need to scale up their operations, if they need to adjust how they're manufacturing things, right, they're tied down. It's very costly to run new cables. They don't have as much flexibility on their plant floors, right? So that's where wireless really comes in.
Absolutely. Dan, is there anything you'd add in terms of what's connected or what are the most important things that are connected? And maybe we can start to get into some of those challenges as well.
I'll just I'll dovetail in first with kind of a continuation with what Matt just said. I'm seeing, it's really about the industry 4.0, and it's this generational shift, right? Going from just that machine-based assembly lines to more smart factories, and connectivity is obviously key. And Matt's touched on that. So regarding the importance of or the important connected devices with that, it really depends on each different manufacturer, but there are definitely some themes, right? So you got safety, security, automation, autonomous vehicles, AR and VR, things like digital twins, machine learning, and, the big buzzword right now, AI, right? And so that connectivity is definitely required for all that data collection. It's data heavy for Industry 4.0. You have to be connected to collect that.
So in terms of collecting all this data and connecting all of these things, whether it's things that they want to connect now or that manufacturers want to connect in the future, what are some of the challenges that they're facing, especially when it comes to creating a wireless LAN? Like Matt, you were saying, wired is the challenge. So as they're moving to like this wireless environment, what are some of the challenges that manufacturers and warehousing facilities are facing?
So I would say, one of the biggest challenges, these are very dynamic environments, first and foremost, right? So if you think about all of the different types of products, let's use warehousing as an example, all the different products that are moving inside of a warehouse, whether it's big or small. It could be a pallet of water, right? Water isn't really, it doesn't really work well with RF. It's hard to penetrate. There could be a lot of metal there. The shelves can be up, 30 feet. Things are constantly moving around, right? And it could be, some warehouses are small. They can be, tens or hundreds of thousands of square feet, but there's also a lot out there that are millions of square feet, or they have acres or miles to cover outdoors, right? So to require that kind of coverage, a lot of legacy wireless solutions such as Wi-Fi, they pretty much they don't cut it for the use cases and for some of the specific requirements that they have. But Dan, what are your thoughts? What are you saying?
Yeah, in manufacturing, the environment itself is the major challenge in a lot of cases, right? So there's lots of things to consider. Is it indoor, outdoor, combination of both? What's the scale? How many devices are you going to connect to this 5G network that you're installing, right? What's the construction method? We've been to some very old factories that are over 100 years old. It's very difficult to propagate signal through thick brick walls, right? In some cases, stone. So that's difficult. Also, there's a ton of EMI sources, lots of interference sources around from electric motors, these industrial processes, there's furnaces, all sorts of things going on. So each manufacturer is a bit different, and it's all about the use case that we're implementing, the problem that we're solving. But, all those is definitely a challenge in those environments. Wi-Fi, as we know, just doesn't meet some of the larger scale sort of things. So that's where we're bridging over and providing that connectivity.
One thing that I would add actually to that as well, and to kind of get into the use case side of things too, is just around mobility, right? A lot of the use cases that manufacturers and warehouse and logistics companies are looking to implement are highly mobile, and they require deterministic performance for that as well. So the last thing you want if you're investing in all of these autonomous mobile robots or AGVs or whatever is them just stopping in the middle of the floor because there's a lack of coverage, or it's sticking to an access point that's on the other side of the facility, right? So what other solutions like what private cellular provides is deterministic mobility, right? So more predictive mobility where the network's actually calling the shots instead of the edge device really guessing at which radio it would connect to is the best one and sticking to that one.
I think too here an expansion of what we mean by mobility or maybe a little bit of focus. And from our standpoint, mobility is anytime you're moving across this network. And so if you think about some of your experiences with Wi-Fi, you could be moving through, several APs that are all having a different issue, delivering a different experience, quality of service. With EP 5G and things that were, the private cellular, you're moving through less APs. We're able to curate that experience, slice networks, things like that, just a little bit more efficiently than we have in the past.
As these manufacturers and warehousing facilities are implementing private network solutions, are they just getting rid of all of their other connectivity and putting in private networks, or are they making it more of like a hybrid network? Like, what's the best architecture in these scenarios?
So I think it really is. It's all use case driven, right? Is the best way to put it. I think there's going to be different layers of connectivity, specifically from a wireless perspective, that are going to be used for different things, right? And a lot of it is around, again, it's driven from the use case. Wi-Fi is typically best effort type connectivity, kind of carpeted areas, office laptops, that kind of stuff, where if it goes down, if you have issues, it doesn't halt operations, I guess is the best way to put it, right? But then as you move towards business critical type applications and devices, where if that goes down, then it's costing you money or time or whatever, right? Then that's where you need a more reliable, more sustainable network that can scale with your business, and you really count on that network. So that's where private cellular comes in. But there's also a place inside of a lot of environments, and actually outside of a lot of environments, for public carrier coverage still in the same environment there as well, right? So I think it's important to have different layers of wireless connectivity, and even to a certain extent wired connectivity inside of a facility. But what drives how they're used is really the use case. But Dan, what are your thoughts?
No, I'd agree with that. It's the hybrid network, right? It's not about selecting one size fits none. It's let's select the right solution for the problem. And not force fit, a technology like Wi-Fi into something that doesn't work in. We don't try to use Bluetooth in a warehouse, to shoot across a warehouse, just because it's not the right technology for it. And so the ability to mix and match, and you brought up the macro carriers, very often there's good reasons to pull those networks in, testing telematics, things like that, right? The ability to do that on site where you don't have signal or in a manufacturing, a production line area, things like that, right? So it's about how you're using that hybrid network and the strategy that you put behind it, right? I think is the important part.
Yeah, and on the public carrier side too, I think one thing to note is sometimes we take it for granted, just like sometimes we take Wi-Fi for granted as well. But if you say, for example, if you have, again, we keep using this 1 million square foot facility, but if you have a very large facility, right, and say somebody gets injured or there's a fire or something like that, and somebody simply can't call emergency services, they don't have any, then that's obviously it's a safety concern, but it's also a liability for that end customer there as well, right? So having all of those layers of connectivity, so essentially you can do business, you can make sure that the facility is safe, right, and then also all of your workers can communicate there is absolutely important.
Exactly. It's just extending, that macro carrier infrastructure into your environment, and you get all the benefits of that, right? All these people are walking around. They already have accounts. They already have phones. You're just given the ability to use their own gear.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty excellent point, right? Is that private cellular network is, even in manufacturing, is not a panacea for everything, right? There's going to be office space inside that manufacturing facility where Wi-Fi is going to be the best for just those workers doing those office tasks and not necessarily being able to join the private cellular network, where inside the manufacturing facility for those AGVs or robotics or even the people working the line, private cellular is going to be very important. And then even whatever they're manufacturing, those goods have to be transported, right? And so you're going to have trucks coming in and out. And so the ability to roam seamlessly, both from the private cellular network there on site to the macro network as the trucks come and go, being able to ensure that seamless communication for their use case for electronic logbooks or inventory management or whatever it is. So it does create that need for basically all types of networking in that single facility, and not just a one-size-fits-all kind of technology.
And is there quite a bit of test? I assume there is, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about kind of the testing and the pre-work that goes into putting in one of these networks. I imagine that there's a lot of that happens to get it right on the install. Is that correct?
No, absolutely. So, it starts, we're down to floor plans. how their equipment's distributed. We have to study the environment pretty well. So we kick off with floor plans and models, do some predictive modeling. And that's iterative, right? You got to work through that. So are you designing primarily for coverage, load, all that you take in all those different factors, make sure you can cover it. And then from there, we always require a site survey. And with the site survey, we're just making sure that our assumptions match reality. Is there power near where we wanted to put a AP? Is there, rack space, things like that, right? Is there a new piece of equipment that we didn't take into account on the floor plan? Are they making changes? These are highly dynamic environments. And we see changes happening that we weren't aware that were going to happen. We finish a project and now there's something that's going up that's going to block one of our APs and we have to adjust. So there's a lot of that has to go. You just have to be ready to stay agile as you move through the process, adjust to different things that come up and just continue to look ahead, right?
Absolutely.
I want to kind of touch on something you just said, Dan, and going back to something that Matt said, right, is like, these are really highly dynamic environments, and PCN is a pretty flexible, which also means that it can grow with you, right? Just because you mentioned, Dan, right, something may go up that blocks an access point, but as the businesses scale, right, as they add more robotics or more manufacturing capabilities, it's easy to just come back in and potentially just add another cellular access point in order to get that coverage or move that kind of coverage around whatever object may have gone on to interfere. Can you guys talk about being able to kind of go and revisit the network and be able to easily scale that for the customer's needs?
Yeah, and when we say easily scale it in an industrial environment, right? That's a relative term, but much easier than one would suppose, right? So once we have the design, we can tweak that at any time, right? So if new use cases are adopted, we can look at those. There might be some network configurations that we make changes there to accommodate that, but really, it's you just keep stacking on. This is how it's the same as the carriers. It's just we're using in a lot of cases carrier grade equipment. It's built to scale into thousands and thousands. So really, we can start small and scale all the way up. Will it take reinvestment if we're doing something crazy? Absolutely, but odds are it's just going to be kind of iterative and additive. Once we hit certain breakpoints, we'll have to drop in more servers, things like that. But we'll know that in advance.
But one other thing I've seen too to add on to that as well is scaling, not just from a coverage perspective, but also from a performance perspective as well, right? So some customers, when they first start with a private cellular network, they might start with 4G, right? But as they're kind of figuring out their strategy for the private cellular network, they want to make sure that they're future-proofing their investment, right? So that's another thing that can be done, right? Is they can have a hybrid type network, 4G and 5G, based off of the use cases in certain environments, or there's certain solutions out there that have a seamless upgrade, right? So you don't have to rip and replace all of the hardware to transition from a 4G network to a 5G network there as well.
Correct. And EP5G is a great example, right? That's just a licensing change to move to 5G, as long as you have the right APs.
So I'd love to dive into a little bit of a real life example of how private networks can transform manufacturing operations. Dan, can you tell us a little bit about the project you work on with Toyota Material Handling?
Yeah, I'd love to share a little bit on that. Maybe I'll start with just giving some of the challenges and things that we had to overcome and kind of walk through how we implemented the project and the outcome. So it's we're implementing EP5Gs. It's, again, a dynamic warehouse environment. There's stacks of goods coming and going off the shelf. This is Toyota Materials Handling Worldwide Parts Distribution Center. So it's not only for their manufacturing facility that's on site. About 1 in 5 parts goes over there. The rest go out into the world. So it's a very critical environment for them business wise. It's about 180,000 square feet. And it is a campus environment. And that was important because we're implementing in some data centers that weren't in the same building, right? We were distributed across the site for different pieces. So that was the setup. They had been using Wi-Fi for their folks when they go out, and they were struggling with a lot of SAP connection issues, right? So they'd go out, they disconnect. One of the warehouse workers would find that they disconnect in a particular area of the warehouse. It could take up to 30 minutes to reconnect. So that was causing a great deal of frustration for obviously management, causing a great deal of overtime, employee frustration, things like that. So that was the other side of that problem, right? So the way that we solved the problem in the warehouse, right? So the implementation for Wi-Fi is left in place, right? That's still a valuable network that solves some issues for them. As far as the production area, we were able to replace 39 Wi-Fi APs with 2 microcells in this 180,000 square foot space. And that allowed us the coverage that we needed.
So, Dan, you talked about some of the challenges that were in place. Matt, is there anything that you would add to that?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I heard, a big thing when we were speaking to this organization as well, right, is outside of just the connectivity problems, employee morale was down, right? If they're requiring devices, specifically scanners, to be able to execute on their job and they can't do it, right, then they're very frustrated, right? I've heard horror stories at a couple trade shows that I've been at. Actually, I'm at a trade show called Automate Today here in Chicago, and the connectivity horror stories that I hear are really fundamental connectivity use cases that they have. And I've heard multiple folks even say, listen, they broke this device almost over their knee because they couldn't get it to work, right? So that's one problem, is the employee morale. The other side of things is also overtime, right? If they can't do their job, they're going to have to work longer. So overtime goes up, frustrations go up, right? And connectivity can solve for that. Private cellular can solve for that from a business critical applications perspective. And that was one key problem inside of this warehouse facility that Dan described. And then the other challenge that I don't know if we touched on, Dan, was in their manufacturing facility in the same campus. They didn't have any kind of macro coverage, right? So they wanted to make sure that vendors that would come into that facility, right, number one, would be able to connect, that employees could call home if they needed to, just to touch base with their loved ones, but also, God forbid, if there was any kind of emergency or an incident or something like that, they can call emergency services there as well, right? So this was one of those kind of unique environments, as separate buildings, but they deployed a macro covered extension in the manufacturing facility, and then a private cellular network in their warehousing facility to help with business critical type operations, specifically those scanners. And then, Dan, to your point earlier, expanding to additional use cases like AGVs, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the other use case that primarily drove the RDS system that we put in was their telemetry systems. They were building telemetry into these vehicles that they manufacture there, but they weren't able to test on the macro carriers. There's just no coverage. So that solved that immediate problem, along with all the morale and everything else that goes with it, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and the telemetry, and also I believe some of it was also predictive maintenance they're embedding in some of these vehicles they're creating. It's interesting. Everybody, when they think Toyota, they go straight to the Toyota vehicles. These are actually forklifts and autonomous kind of box movers inside of facilities that they're manufacturing there. They're really, really well known there too. They embed modules, embed SIM cards, and have sensors inside of a lot of those vehicles as well for predictive maintenance. So that way they can get ahead of any kind of service issues. So that way their customers don't have any downtime there as well. They need to activate those SIMs. They need to test them. Right?
Absolutely. And they're multi-carrier SIMs. It's fairly sophisticated. So when these fork trucks go out into the world, they can communicate those exact things, right? All their maintenance schedules, what's going wrong, any trouble lights, things like that. So,
yeah.
Awesome. Do you guys have any insight on how they plan to further leverage the private network in the future? Like, do they have ideas of new things that they want to implement that they can now because this network's in place?
Yeah, well, it's going to be expansion. So you got to remember, this is a very large campus out there. So the warehouse has the EP5G, and then we have a RDS system that we put in on their Plant 1, Line 1, which is one of 2 production lines, and then also in their R&D area, right? Just, again, for telematics and things like that. So in the future... So we have 2 implementations basically out there. This is a large campus environment. There's 4 plants, and there's some expected expansion to occur in the future. So what we have right now is we've implemented an RDS system where we've pulled in macro carrier coverage into their production, their Line 1, Plant 1 area, which is a production area. And then we've also pulled that same RDS system into their R&D fab. And then their warehouse, we implemented the EP5G system. So the expansion plan as we continue will be to pull that EP5G into the production line area, and we'll start looking at what to connect on there. So we're doing some studies around that. And then we'll pull in the macro, we'll extend macro carrier coverage into some other areas of the campus, like into the warehouse, things like that, so that they'll have the connectivity options. The hybrid network that they'll have throughout that environment will be very robust. They'll have lots of options. I like to tell people that around hybrid network, just look at the phone in your pocket and all the connectivity options that you have there, right? You can connect via cellular, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, near field communications. You can plug it in. And this is just for us on a personal level. Imagine if you had to build fork trucks, right? That gets a lot more complex and your needs change immediately in those. So they'll have this hybrid network throughout their campus that they'll be able to utilize in a very effective manner.
Yeah, I'm going to steal that analogy from you. Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah.
And then Dan, I think one other thing that I'd add too. I mean, one thing I'm seeing more broadly, and maybe Toyota's doing this, maybe they're not, is a lot of organizations will start with a smaller type deployment, right? Maybe first and foremost for a specific use case, maybe an immediate pain point that they have. But then what they do is they take a look at that and they see how do they optimize it, but more so they use that as a blueprint for other facilities, for other use cases, right? So that way they can replicate it in a faster way. The first one's always the hardest, right? And then outside of that, it gets a lot easier and it starts to scale. Is that how they're looking at this as well?
To a degree, right? I see a couple different approaches with different customers, and I will throw a caution here. The customers that come in and seem to boil the ocean, and with use cases, they're trying to solve, basically for world peace. They've got 50 different use cases, all these different things. Those are very difficult, and they usually kind of drift away, and they're hard to implement, and low probability of success in that sort of environment. Where I find more success is if you can limit it, to a few use cases that are manageable that we can pull through, and that are a good enough reason to get that first one in there. Right, that's really the hurdle. Once it's in, it's kind of like a Christmas tree. Everyone gets really excited once you get that tree in the stand, and they want to throw their decoration on there too. And that's kind of what happens in these environments. Once you get it in place, people can easily start to see, oh, can we put this on here? Oh, can this be done? So we're going back in to some of our customers, and we're actually having kind of like tech days where we're talking to their engineers and trying to foster some ideation and different things, like what else can they add to these? That ROI just increases, right, as you add more use cases. But limited on the front end, and it's very much like you see there, Matt, but it's better to go that route.
Yeah.
Through that, that Christmas tree example just made me think, are there other things that you guys feel manufacturers should consider when deploying private 5G throughout their campuses? I think one of the considerations is that the use cases may grow, and you don't necessarily need to do them all at the beginning. You can expand. Are there other considerations for manufacturers to keep in mind?
Yeah, I think that you step back and build a strategy around the hybrid network that you need. I think that's the most important factor. Is you're not just one network, and we're pouring all our resources into this one thing. It's what do we need across this facility to be efficient, right? And everywhere is different. What's important to one facility is not the same thing as somewhere else. So we work with the steel manufacturer. This camera data in a ladle bay is the most important thing. They can't have people in there other than these crane operators, with 150-ton ladles of molten steel, right? So it's very important and critical in that environment for cameras. Out at TMH right now, we're not really running any cameras. There's no reason for it, right? The critical things for those guys are something else. But it's really, you got to think about that strategy. What does it look like in the near term, midterm, long term? Where are we going with this? What are the things we can put on? How can we reduce the cost of this by implementing more use cases? All those sort of things, right? So if you take a strategic approach and you can use each piece of that hybrid to its strength, play to the strength of Wi-Fi, play to the strength of Bluetooth, the wired, all those sort of things, you should have a very, very robust environment that's implemented off of a thoughtful approach, right?
Yeah, I would say, just to get into some more specifics, right, is also just from a planning perspective, understanding kind of the nuts and bolts of how you're actually going to execute on the project, right? Planning and project management is key, and having a key partner in there that can help you kind of work through all those nuances is really important. I think Dan mentioned earlier, a key consideration is where are you going to hang the radios, right? Where are you actually going to put them? It's, oftentimes it might not be the most optimal place, but the good news about private cellular is that it has broad coverage, right? One single private cellular access point indoor can cover up to 5 times the amount as a Wi-Fi AP. Outdoors is 10 times or more, right? So you have more flexibility on where you can hang the radios, but it's also cable runs and kind of getting to the really specific details on the implementing it, right? From a construction and project management perspective, I think it should be part of the overarching strategy that Dan had mentioned, right?
Absolutely. I would say there's a bit of a checklist from a customer perspective on things that I would look for if I was, looking for a partner to help implement any hybrid network, and especially where it has components of RDS or EP5G, PCN, any of that sort of stuff, right? And one of those things would definitely be, does that partner have a PMO office? Are they used to implementing large projects in an efficient manner? You have to have a PM to keep everything on the rails. So we kind of work through these things stepwise. There's a lot of change. And again, it's back to dynamic environments. With Toyota, even when we were out there, the requirements changed as we were in process, we'll say. So that flexibility has to be a part of it.
Awesome. Dan, Matt, thank you guys both for joining us today to talk about these private networks in the manufacturing and warehousing industry. Before we close out, Dan, can you share a little bit of where our listeners can find out more about STEP and the work you do there?
Yeah, I would say our website, right? And from there, you can see all the different things. There's different data sheets, success stories, anything like that. If you have any inquiries or need to get a hold of us, you can. There's contact information there, or you can reach out to me directly, dgregory@stepcg.com. Be happy to have a discussion with you about any of this stuff.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much, guys. It's been a pleasure having you this morning.
Thanks, all. Appreciate it.
So, Mauricio, one thing I appreciated about having Dan on was that we got to kind of dive into that example of the Toyota materials handling case study. And especially because we know, even just from talking a little bit in our failover and downtime podcast, that any downtime can cost thousands of dollars in manufacturing and other industries, hundreds of thousands. The number just goes up and up and up. And I think what's cool is that with places like Toyota Materials Handling, like what we talked about, they can implement these networks and see improvements and benefits almost immediately. I mean, in this case, OT dropped by about 50% in the first month after implementing this solution, which is incredible.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to see that, people tend to think of manufacturing as this kind of old, stodgy kind of area of technology, right? You tend to think of manufacturing as slow to change and slow to adopt new technologies. But the funny thing is like we mark time and we mark technology by industrial revolutions, right? Dan mentioned Industry 4.0, which is just kind of, industry shorthand for the fourth industrial revolution, right? Which is marked by the digitization of manufacturing. And manufacturing tends to be the forerunner or the leader in adopting new technologies, right? Where in the digitization of manufacturing, we're talking about integrating robotics and co-working between humans and robotics and integrating AI to increase those efficiencies. But all of those industrial revolutions have been led by manufacturing, right? Because the first was going from a more, agricultural centric society to a industrial society, the early manufacturing and early industry. And then the second revolution was, how do we make that more efficient, right? The steam engine and machinery inside that manufacturing so that, the pieces weren't individually created by a person, they were created by machines. And then the third was marked by introducing computers, right? While computers and networking were really the domain of scholars in the early days, manufacturing was one of the first places to adopt those. You see those in PLC controllers and other legacy technologies within manufacturing, and now they're kind of leading the way in robotics and autonomous vehicles and AI in creating those additional efficiencies. So manufacturing has really been kind of on that forefront, and so to see people like Toyota really embracing that and how they can create additional efficiencies with those additional networking technologies is really interesting. And they are going to lead the way in how these technologies are adopted by other businesses and industries.
Absolutely. Thanks for tuning in, all. If you enjoyed today's chat with our industry experts and talking about this great innovation in the manufacturing industry, we invite you to rate and subscribe to What's Your Signal wherever you listen to podcasts so you can join in on more conversations.